Irish Nation, welcome to the show. I am your co host, Brett, joined as always by my co host, Mike. We are here to discuss your Sugar Bowl champion, Notre Dame Fighting Irish, as they head down to Miami to take on the Penn State Nittany Lions in this year's Orange Bowl semifinal to the college football playoff. The field of 134 teams are down to four, and Mike, we're in the final four. How you feeling about this preview?
I feel great. Every show that we've had since NIU, it's just it hasn't been a linear improvement entirely, but really since that point, it's been, I would say, generally speaking, uh, every time we've checked in, the program has gotten better and better and better and better. And then now we're getting to the point to where we're being talked amongst elite programs in the land, and that continues to be the case. So we mentioned this last week. Notre Dame is a real title contender. We'll temper expectations with the fact that we're not favorites, but we do have a realistic chance of winning the title this year. It's not a long shot. I think the latest probability I saw was somewhere around 20%. If we win this game, which is very much a winnable game, this is a game that we're favored in as of now per the Vegas betting odds. That probability goes up even more. So we're we're seeing this in the press. Notre Dame's getting a lot of love right now. I think the fact that Marcus Freeman is such a likable guy and he's really carried the program the right way has made Notre Dame a lot more likable than it has been in the past. And we're really seeing a lot of pundits and people in the media talk up Notre Dame, which is great. It is also kind of a scary place to be because you don't want the team to feel that too much. So if you start feeling that too much, then you kind of let your guard down. However, I think this team has certainly learned this lesson from the NIU game that I mentioned earlier. I think that we're locked and loaded. Freeman mentioned that shortly after the Georgia game, when he met with the captains, before they even had the conversation, the captain said, "Hey, coach, we're ready. Let's like move on to Penn State right now. We're ready to go." So it seems like these guys are all business, uh, presumably canceling out all the noise. It's fun as a fan to hear all the positive noise that's happening, but as for the team, I would expect that they're going to be locked and loaded, just focused on the opponent.
I'm glad you're bringing the glass half full excitement. I'm admittedly nervous, but I think I'm as nervous as I expected to be. This is as much homework as I think I've ever done for a preview for Gyrish Talk. We have 7 pages of notes. We've dug into every part of this Penn State football team, and they are a really, really good team. They have every reason to be as optimistic as Notre Dame's fans are. And look, the Notre Dame Georgia game was a coin flip. I get it. We won 23-10. We had some things go our way with turnover luck. We had some things go our way with special teams, kickoff returns that are not always the easiest to replicate. Game over, game over, game over. Penn State's had that too. Penn State's had a lot of turnover luck in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. And I say turnover luck. Look, great defenses force turnovers. They create havoc that puts themselves in a position for those types of plays. But Penn State and Notre Dame is a coin flip. I actually, stare at this on paper. I think Penn State is maybe not as athletic and talented as a team as Georgia, but they are certainly a more complete team when you look at their offense and defense. It's really hard to sit and say that's the hole. That's the issue. Now, part of that was because Carson Beck was injured. I maybe would have had a different view on Georgia with Carson Beck, but with Gunnar Stockton, they were not as complete of a team as what we're going to face in Penn State. So I'm really excited to dive into this. I think Notre Dame has a great shot. That doesn't mean I'm nervous we're going to win or lose. That just means I'm nervous that this is a really, really awesome. I keep saying almost NFL caliber series of matchups here coming down the stretch where I don't think there's going to be a game in the college football playoff where the spread is, more than a touchdown. Like these are going to feel like NFL spreads, really close, competitive teams. Four of the best teams here in college football are left at the end, and I think it's going to make for a really great show. Going down to Miami here at the end of the week on Thursday night. So let's dive in. Started off with a section on James Franklin. He's got a little bit of the Brian Kelly in him. He's not the most likable coach. He's flubbed up big games. He's flubbed up clock management. Like he's given Penn State fans all of the reason to just not like James Franklin, despite being a really successful coach. He's won a lot of football games at Penn State, but still, I think hasn't quieted the critics. And I think part of it is he wrinkles feathers with the media. Like there's a real Brian Kelly um, narrative about James Franklin, maybe just 15, 20 years younger than BK. But Mike, I'm curious, walk us through kind of what we've been able to learn and dig up here on big game James Franklin.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, he hasn't won the big game yet. Four for 19 or 4 and 19 against top 10 teams. Before he was 3 and 19 before the Boise State game. 1 and 12 against top 5 teams. And look, it's not easy to beat top 5 teams. That's if you have a above 500 record against top 5 teams, you're likely a title contender regularly. Drew Aller, just as a side note here, he's just 1 and 4 as a quarterback in those top 10 matchups. So interestingly, it's funny being on the other side of this now. I would say there's more pressure on James Franklin winning the big game than on Notre Dame. We just beat Georgia, so we finally got over that hump. But these programs are very similar in that both have gone decades without winning big games. Um, and I think maybe with Freeman, even though the pressure was on Notre Dame, I don't think before Georgia, I don't think the pressure was on Freeman specifically quite as much. Or if he was, I think it probably wasn't a fair criticism because look, he was competitive against Ohio State twice. We really should have won that one game at home. We pretty much had that one in the bag and blew it. We beat Texas A&M on the road, Clemson on the road. That's one that people often forget. That was a massive win at the time, and we just completely blew them off. And now you can add Georgia on a neutral site. So I think at this point, I don't think there's any question that Marcus Freeman can have his team ready to play in a big game. I don't think there's any question that he can win the big game. So I think at this point, if you're looking at the two programs, it's Franklin personally who hasn't won the big ones. And this year is just another example. It's more of the same for Franklin. So they have losses to Oregon and Ohio State. They did beat SMU in the first round, but technically not a top 10 program, at least in the AP polls, and not an SP plus. They did beat Boise State, top 10 in the polls, but 21 in SP plus. So from an AP poll standpoint, looks impressive. But if you look at a predictive metric that kind of tells you how good this team really is, I would say Boise State is probably not the team that you would want to. I don't think it's a team that you could count as a truly a big win. Their big wins this season: 21-7 over Illinois, 33-30 in a thrilling overtime win against USC. They blew out, as I mentioned, SMU 38-10, and they blew out Boise State 31-14. So, look, these are good wins, but they're not those top tier wins that like Georgia. They're not those top tier wins that really give you the credibility to state yourself as a national title contender. For instance, it is 3 wins against SP plus SP plus teams in the top 10 through 25, and 2 more in the top 40, but none in that top 5 range. And just for a reference point here, Notre Dame has 4 wins against SP plus top 25 teams, and then on top of that, these wins, a lot of this season had a lot of close calls. So USC actually, I mentioned that they won that game, and that was one of their better wins. But that game was very close. USC really had that team beat, and they just blew a late lead and lost in overtime. Penn State survived a 1-point win against Minnesota. Minnesota's been a pretty plucky squad for a while now, so it's obviously not. It's there's no shame necessarily in having a close game against Minnesota. But if you're a title contender, you'd like to do better than that. But they essentially ran a 6-minute drive to burn clock to end the game. So that game was not out of question really until the end. And then one data point that I think got overlooked quite a bit this year, particularly as we were getting into the rankings and the rationale of the committee and which team should be ranked higher than the other, was Penn State had a close call against Bowling Green. They had a close 7-point win. And I think whereas Notre Dame, like we lost NIU, obviously, right? That was like one of the biggest talking points of the season. One thing that I don't think got quite enough of a look was that Penn State really almost, they had a very similar situation, and they almost fell as well. Obviously, they won, so they don't get ding nearly as much, rightfully so. But I think the fact that they were, letting a team like that hang in, that does call into question the championship quality and consistency of this team. But I think all that aside, if you look at their entire body of work, you're not going to find any perfect resumes, especially this year when the parity is the way it is. They're still hands down a great team. SP plus, which is the metric we lean on the most. They have this team basically toe to toe with Notre Dame, and we believe Notre Dame is a championship contender this year. So by virtue of that, Penn State is certainly a championship contender as well. And interestingly, both teams are built very similarly. So I mentioned how close they are in SP plus. Penn State is number 6. Notre Dame is number 7. So Penn State is actually a tiny bit higher. Although the ratings edge is not, it's very narrow. So they're only per SP Plus, they would only be favored by zero point 0.3 on a neutral field, which is very much a toss up. Both teams are very balanced. Penn State has the number 7 offense. Notre Dame has number 6. Penn State has the number 5 defense. Notre Dame has number 4. So really, it's similar to Georgia. What's kind of driving that swing towards Penn State is special teams. So they have a better special teams than Notre Dame because as you could tell from my comments just here, Notre Dame has technically the higher ranked offense and the higher ranked defense. And then even just aside from that, these teams are both very physical in the trenches. They have both above average but not elite quarterback play. I think Drew Aller certainly as a passer, he's more effective as Riley Leonard. But I think it's fair to say that both have effective quarterbacks, but perhaps not elite. And then both teams are very effective at running the ball. Penn State has 2 elite running backs that have both rushed for 1,000 yards. One of those names is a familiar name to Notre Dame fans who closely follow recruiting. It's Nick Singleton. Nick Singleton, who nearly committed to Notre Dame a few years ago. And then they also have an All-American Mackey Award winner tight end Tyler Warren. But aside from that, they don't. I would say the receiver core looks very, very similar to ours. So there are some differences, but overall, very balanced teams, very physical, and a lot of their strengths align. So I think this is just again, I clearly I'm optimistic about Notre Dame, but I think as a football fan, this is a very intriguing matchup, and I think it would be hard to overwhelmingly believe that one team has the edge here.
Very similar view. I mean, it it feels like Penn State and Notre Dame have and James Franklin have recruited really well, have developed really well, have maybe done it without the kind of SEC talent, if you will, but have put themselves at the top of college football, have been knocking on the door for a really long time, but haven't won a title in forever. Haven't won that big, have that big game overhang. And one of these two coaches is going to get to play for a national title. And I think that in of itself is a headline too that I wanted to spend some time talking about. Either Marcus Freeman or James Franklin will make history by becoming the first ever black coach to play in the championship game in college football in a sport where 46% of players are black. This is the first time a coach will play in the title game. I think that is awesome for college football. I think it's awesome for our society. I was a little bummed to see some stuff in message boards about why do we have to be talking about this headline. So I wanted to spend time talking about why we should be talking about this headline and why the media is covering it and why I'm glad we are. And I think for a lot of listeners, I hope this is really obvious on why it's a big deal. But for the avoidance of doubt, being the first of anything is a milestone. Being the first black in anything is a racial milestone. It signals diversity. It signals paving the way for future success. I remember growing up as a kid hearing absurd stereotypes about the only black quarterbacks are the athletic running quarterbacks, and they're inevitably going to get hurt, and they're never going to be able to be championship caliber. And then Warren Moon and Randall Cunningham would get cited all the time. I grew up a Packers fan in Minnesota, watched Randall Cunningham go 15-1 and lead the Vikings to the Super Bowl with Randy Moss and Chris Carter. It was one of the greatest offenses of all time. And I hated Randall Cunningham purely because I was a Packers fan. I would have loved to have had that guy on my team. Like, he wasn't, just an athletic QB. He was a great quarterback that almost won a Super Bowl. And since then, that's not the narrative anymore. We've stopped talking about that. Sure, we talk about Lamar Jackson being an athletic dual threat quarterback, but we also talk about Patrick Mahomes in GOAT conversations. We talk about Lamar Jackson, I think, trying to win his third MVP now. In fact, nearly half of starting quarterbacks on this week in the NFL were black. Like half of the league is now starting black quarterbacks. And it's now not a narrative. Like now it would be weird if we were talking about black versus white quarterbacks. But 25 years ago, we had to have that conversation because the barrier wasn't broken yet. Because if you were a black athlete, if you were a black football player, you didn't have a lot of quarterbacks sitting there to be your role model, to be, hey, that's what success looks like for someone that looks like me. And that's still the case for coaching. It's especially true in NCAA. I mentioned 46% of players are black. I think that's a really important stat because players are the future funnel for coaches. Like substantially all head coaches played college football at some level. Marcus Freeman at Ohio State. I looked up James Franklin earlier. It was like FCS level, but he was still a college football athlete, and that's how he broke into the industry. So 46% of the funnel is black, and it is really rare to be the Charlie Weiss guy that's just a fan in the crowd and eventually becomes a coach. And so despite 46% of the funnel being black, only 12% of FBS head coaches are black this year in college football. 12%, 14 coaches. Um, so this is important. This is significant for the sport. I think it's significant for our culture. I think it normalizes racial diversity. I think it chips away at stereotypes. Even Marcus Freeman is the stereotype of the guy that can connect with coaches or with high school players, the guy that can recruit. He's the young black guy that can recruit. No, he's the guy that just outsmarted Kirby Smart in the Sugar Bowl. He just outsmarted the best tactician that exists in the sport since Nick Saban retired. He's a great football coach, period. And so I'm really excited about this storyline. I love that there is going to be a black coach representing one of these two schools in the national championship. I hope we have more diversity in the future. And I hope in 10, 15 years, we aren't talking about this headline. But today, on January 5th, 2025, we are, and I think we should be. And I get really excited about that narrative.
Totally agree, Brett. I think that was really well said. The way I view it is the goal is to get to the point to where it is no longer a storyline, but we're not there yet. So in the meantime, as of right now, before that barrier has truly been broken, it must be a storyline, and it's something that you really need to praise when it does happen, a meaningful moment like that. So yeah, Brett, I think that was, I thought that was a great. I thought your thoughts there were a great summary of why this is important and why it's so meaningful. Now with that, let's dive into the game a little bit more. I'm going to jump into the offense. I'm going to start with Tyler Warren because that's the best. Well, look, I don't. That's the best player on offense for Penn State. I was going to say that's the best player on the team, but they have some studs on defense as well. But Tyler Warren is unquestionably their most talented player on offense. He's this year's Michael Mayer. 98 catches on 128 targets. So when he's targeted, that's a 77% completion percentage, 12 yards per catch, 8 touchdowns. Clearly the best tight end in the country. Mackey Award winner. Remarkably consistent, at least 3 catches in every single game. And he's had 9 games with 6 or more catches. If I look at the Boise game in particular, 2 touchdowns. He also had 84 yards against Oregon and then 102 yards against a very good Minnesota defense. And if I look at the USC game, USC, we called them out as much improved defense this year. I wouldn't call them a good defense necessarily, but I think an okay defense. He was targeted 20 times and caught 17 catches for 224 yards. So extremely impressive stat line. Maybe not against an elite defense, but against an okay defense. And look, this is where I would say Notre Dame and Penn State are similar in that they both have strong tight end play, but Penn State definitely they definitely take the cake here in terms of an edge. Their tight end play is as good as it gets in all of college football. Notre Dame's in good shape in terms of tight end play, but certainly not at the level of Tyler Warren. And then the person getting on the ball is Drew Aller. So I'll mention his recruiting profile here because that's important. He was a 5-star quarterback coming out of high school, number 32 recruit per the 24/7 composite. So interestingly, that's right at the cutoff where that's right at the line between 4-star and 5-star status. He got the 5-star status. So someone who's obviously very highly touted, has great physical tools. He's a big quarterback, really strong arm, and he has some experience. He's a junior. He's already announced he's going to come back next year. Currently, his projections for the NFL draft are around a 2nd or 3rd round pick. I think he's hoping that if he comes back next year, he'll be able to become more consistent and play himself into 1st round status. In terms of his Pro Football Focus grade for this year, he ranks 15th. He's 18th in yards, although he has an extra couple games now, so that's a little inflated. I think one area in particular I want to call out with him is how effective he is at protecting the ball. This is something that we call out with Riley Leonard. Riley Leonard is very good at, in the face of pressure, avoiding the big mistake. He doesn't throw many interceptions. He doesn't take many sacks. Well, Aller is also extremely effective at that as well. So he only has 7 interceptions on the year. Pro Football Focus actually tracks a metric called turnover-worthy plays. It's essentially throws where the quarterback could or should have had the ball intercepted, regardless of what the outcome was. So even if it wasn't intercepted, but if the corner had his hands on it and just happened to drop it, that would certainly be a turnover worthy play. So it won't count as an interception, but it will count as in this column. So Drew Aller, he only has 7 of these turnover worthy plays on the year. So just 1.6% of his attempts. It's number 5 in the country. As we mentioned, Riley Leonard is also very effective at this as well. He's number 10, just a notch below at 1.8%. So both quarterbacks extremely effective at protecting the ball. Um, and then kind of with that, we mentioned how good he is at avoiding like these havoc type plays. So that also translates into sacks. He's only taken 18 sacks all year on 135 pressures, so 13% of the time. Again, I'll use Riley Leonard here as a comp. He only takes sacks 11.5% of the time when pressured. So both of these guys, very similar. I think fair to say elite in terms of avoiding the havoc plays. In terms of how they utilize Drew Aller, it's a lot of play action. They run play action about 30% of his dropbacks. That's not absurdly high like a Tennessee or an Ole Miss, but very high rate, and they're very successful at it. 9 yards per attempt, 8 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions out of play action. I think one thing that aids that is that they have a very effective run game that you have to respect. And Brett and I certainly we firmly believe that you don't need an effective run game to run play action. We believe that play action is effective in and of itself. But Penn State does have a very effective run game, and I think that aids their play action. So, Brett, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about that run game, which is a key part of this offense.
Yeah, it's really similar to um, what you get out of Notre Dame with a two-headed monster at running back. Allen and Singleton, their two running backs, have both topped 1,000 yards. Both have at least 8 rushing touchdowns on the year. Both grade out very well in Pro Football Focus, and they average about 5.5 yards per attempt. So Jadarian Price, Jeremiah Love, very similar. They average about 7 yards attempt, so actually even better than those two, but haven't ran the ball as much. Part of that, by the way, is we have a three-headed monster when you combine Riley Leonard's mobility in there as well. So as you look at this offense, it's like, okay, they have two very similar running backs to us. Their receivers don't have a lot of productivity. Their leading receiver has about 700 yards on the year. And it's then almost like Tyler Warren as the X factor is kind of like Riley Leonard's running is the X factor. And you start summing those up, and it's a really well balanced offense between getting Warren the ball over the middle, between getting it to their receivers in space quite often, but maybe not elite, and then really leaning on the running backs and the running game. That sounds like Notre Dame, leaning on Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price, using Riley Leonard as the X factor, and then when we need to, get the ball to the receivers. And all of that's behind an offensive line that also looks very much like Notre Dame's. They grade out very well in run blocking. They rank 13th in the country in line yards generated in the run game. So how much of that run is attributed to the offensive line? They rank 13th. Overall Pro Football Focus grade is another metric, ranks them 36th in run blocking, but they kind of stink in pass protection. They rank 96th. They give up a lot of pressures. They don't give up a lot of sacks, namely because Drew Aller gets the ball out, but they do give up a lot of pressures and rank 96th in Pro Football Focus's passing grades. And Notre Dame's similar. We rank 70th in pass blocking, but 11th in run blocking. So we're graded out much better blocking in the run, not as good, below average in pass protection. A storyline for them, they lost one of their starting tackles, Anthony Dunca, to a season-ending injury. Apologies if I got that name wrong. About halfway through the year. So reminds me a little bit of Notre Dame's offensive lines, even from a recruiting perspective. They have a 5-star in Nolan Rucci, who transferred in from Wisconsin. They have Drew Shelton, who is a top 150 recruit. And then they got a couple of lower end 3-star guys that were more development prospects, kind of like a Pat Coogan, kind of like an Anthony Knapp or a Joe Walt. I get it. Those guys were maybe a little bit more like low end 4-star, high end 3-star, but it's not just blue chippers out there for them. They've also developed really well in bringing out the best of that offensive line. And so you pull that all together, there's a reason this is a top 10 team in SP plus. And I think the number one thing that stood out to me is they just don't give up havoc. They just don't get disrupted by opposing defenses. They rank number 3 in havoc allowed. Aller doesn't take sacks. Aller doesn't turn the ball over, and their running backs just don't go backwards. And that's been a really, really successful thing for them to stay on schedule, move the chains, keep first downs going. It's very, very Notre Dame like. Um, Mike, I'm curious, something we talked a lot about in our last couple of games was, well, Indiana, though, maybe a really, really good offense, but how do they do against elite competition?
Yep.
Georgia, hey, they've played in the SEC. Like, how have they looked against those really elite defenses in Texas, in Alabama? And we really double clicked on those games. And Penn State's had a pretty darn tough schedule. They faced some really good defenses. How have they gone up against those elite teams?
Definitely. I think it's important because Penn State, they grade out extremely well on offense. They do well, they fare well in the advanced stats. But I think for us, it's important to see if these stats are stress tests. So diving into that, really the results are fairly mixed. So Ohio State, the offense was frankly anemic, 0 offensive touchdowns, 150 passing yards. That was one of Aller's worst games of his career. That was a key thing to keep in mind with Aller is that at times he flashes that NFL potential. He'll flash that NFL arm, but at times he is inconsistent, and this is an example of that. And then interestingly, on the on the rushing attack, they weren't effective either. So they ran for just 3.8 yards per carry. And that was actually led by Tyler Warren having 3 carries for 47 yards on tight end jet sweep. So it wasn't even their backs that were generating their more impactful plays in this game. The running backs combined for less than 50 yards and just 2.4 yards per carry. Now, granted, Ohio State per SP plus is the number one defense in all the land. So it's tough to put up effective offensive numbers against a defense like that. But even accounting for that, these are very, very poor numbers. Against Minnesota, that's another really good top 20 defense, also a struggle. Aller threw for almost 250 yards, but the run game in this case was a no-show. Singleton and Allen combined for 73 yards and just 3.6 yards per carry. And then on the other side of that, I mentioned that the results have been fairly mixed. Against SMU and Oregon, they balled out. So they were aided versus SMU with a couple early pick six. So that kind of makes it a little more difficult to evaluate the offense since it was a blowout so quickly. But against Oregon, which unquestionably an elite team, they ran for almost 300 yards and almost 9 yards per attempt, and almost 9 yards per attempt. Aller threw for 3 touchdowns and over 200 yards. Although he did have 2 costly interceptions, which is uncharacteristic for him. We mentioned that he tends to avoid these types of plays. But against Oregon, he coughed it up a couple times. So against Oregon, they certainly did their part. The offense did. But overall, in the grand scheme of things, it's you don't really. The question is, what version of the Penn State offense are you going to get? Are you going to get the one that you saw against Ohio State and Minnesota, where they seem to struggle a bit more, or are you going to get the one that showed up against Oregon that really balled out and you know uh, showed up against elite competition?
It's
But
interesting too. Like we're being, very nitpicky here too, because it's worth calling out Notre Dame in our 3 games against the 3 best defenses we played. Texas A&M, I get it, opener, maybe throw that one out. The next 2 best defenses we played were Indiana and Georgia, and they were a slog in both of those. Against Georgia, our running backs averaged 3.5 yards a carry. The only reason we had a successful running game at all was Riley Leonard's legs rushing for 80 yards. And against Indiana, we had a 98-yard touchdown. And other than that, our running backs averaged 2 yards a carry. And so, we found enough offense. We found 200 yards passing from Riley Leonard. We did enough to go win those games, but we actually maybe have more data points for us struggling, and we can get to that in a little bit as we look at Penn State's defense of we haven't put up, 45, well, not 45, we haven't put up 38 points against Oregon's defense. We haven't put up the kind of success that they've had in some of these games either. Again, mixed results, mixed reasons for that, pick sixes against SMU, etc. But I do think this isn't to say, Penn State's offense will fall down against elite competition. It's just to say, yeah, like they get slowed down by Ohio State, just like we got slowed down by Georgia.
I think this is an interesting matchup for Notre Dame's defense. I think it's a great matchup for football fans in general. We mentioned that at the beginning. There's not really like that strength on. There's not a big strength on weakness, Brett, which we've alluded to here, that either side can really take advantage of. So we've talked consistently this year how effective Notre Dame's pass defense is. We're number one in pass defense success rate. We're actually 64th in rush success rate, but I think you have to take that stat with a little bit of a grain of salt because we played a lot of run heavy teams, including two option teams that were elite at generating high rush success rates. So 64th, I don't think that's necessarily a good indication of where this defense is in terms of limiting the run game. We were certainly extremely effective at it against a very physical Georgia team. I do think that our secondary and linebackers, I think they're going to match up well to take away Warren in the passing game. Uh, I think particularly the receiver. I feel very confident we're going to shut down the receiver. Someone like Warren, we haven't faced someone like that, but I think just based on the talent that we have in pass coverage and the athleticism that we have, I have to believe that we should at least be able to limit that to a decent extent. I don't think that Penn State has the same athleticism that you see at Texas or Ohio State that might be able to expose the absence of Ben Morrison. This isn't the offense that's going to be able to do that. A bigger question, though, is if we can generate havoc, the same type of havoc that we did against IU and Georgia. And that havoc was absolutely critical in both of those games. Georgia, they were 55th in havoc allowed. So pretty average, but they also had a first time starting quarterback. So that makes it perhaps a bit more likely that they would allow some havoc. IU, they were top 30, but they didn't have that. They don't have the same. They didn't have the same physical offensive line that Penn State does, and they don't have a quarterback. They didn't have a quarterback that was quite as effective at avoiding havoc plays when pressured. So we talked about this when we went through Drew Allar, but I think Penn State. I think they should alleviate. I guess they should be able to limit our ability to generate havoc in this game. I think we will be able to generate some pressure, but Aller has been great at preventing these big time impactful plays by the defense like all year. So I don't see that changing in this game. They've played some elite defenses. He threw a couple interceptions against Oregon, but I think that was probably a bit more of an anomaly. Um, so I don't think we're going to be able to necessarily do what we did against Georgia versus Penn State. I think I think ultimately what this is going to come down to is just physicality and depth in the middle of our defense. So Georgia, they clearly had a game plan to attack the middle of our defense and try to wear down our defensive line, particularly Pinish, Rubio, and Cross. But once they got down in the second half, they had to abandon that plan. I think if Penn State, who is, I think, similarly physical, I think if they're able to commit to that and do it more effectively, that's maybe where you could see a little bit, you could see maybe our defense buckling a little bit. Now, I don't know that's going to happen. Our defense held up overall. We still held up very well against Georgia, but I think this is an area to watch. I think one other thing to keep in mind here is I think this game could be it very likely could be decided if we decide that we need to commit resources to stopping the run and supporting the interior of our defensive line. If we don't have to do that, I think that that's a good sign. I think one aspect I expect to see in this game is a lot of man coverage. That's something that we've done all year. We have very sticky corners. Our secondary is phenomenal. We have very athletic linebackers. I think we're going to attempt to do that, and if we can heavily limit their passing game by that, that does free up some resources otherwise. So then if we have to like allocate some resources to the interior defensive line, that might not be the worst thing. But if we don't have to do that either, then we can start getting, I think, a little bit more creative with what we're calling, and that's when you could start to see us, I think, having our way with the Penn State offense. One other point I want to make here is that Brett and I consistently have called out Al Golden's effectiveness against one-dimensional offenses. This isn't the case. Penn State is very balanced. So it's not exactly as I called out kind of at the beginning of this like overview right here. This isn't the offense that seems like ripe for the picking. It's there are very few weaknesses here. That's the theme for this entire team. There are some areas that you can look at to maybe try to draw a little bit of advantage. I mentioned our ability to maybe limit their passing attack, but look, there's nothing, there's no huge gaps here.
Yeah, Mike, I completely agree with all that. I think one place that gives me a little more hope that Al Golden is going to win the matchup against Penn State's offense is explosiveness, and less about Notre Dame. Notre Dame doesn't give up a lot of big plays, but this is not USC. This is not an explosive offense. They rank 112th in that category, so they are very efficient with the football. They stay on schedule and they put together drives. but this is not the offense that's going to torch Christian Gray. This is not the offense that's super explosive at lighting up big runs or big passes. And no surprise when your number one wide receiver is a tight end, right? That doesn't, sound like an explosive offense. And I say that as in it's really hard to string together 10, 12, 14-yard drives against elite defenses. We talk about that all the time. Georgia's one touchdown drive against Notre Dame was 5 plays. But every other time when they march down the field, they just string together 3, 4, 5, 6 first downs. It's really hard in the college game to keep executing those long scoring drives. And so I I think this is about as good as an offense, certainly as balanced of an offense that Notre Dame's seen all year. I do like Al Golden's odds if you go up and say, you know what, James Franklin, Drew Aller, they got to go and put together multiple 10-play scoring drives. Maybe, but no one's been able to do that against Al Golden this year, and I'll take my shot there. I think that's a pretty good segue to talk about Penn State's defense. It is a stout top 10 defense, and it is built around pressuring the quarterback. I think this is the biggest narrative going into this game. It's the biggest one that, as of right now, has a lot of uncertainty around it. And Notre Dame fans should be checking their Google search results daily on the injury status of Abdul Carter. He is the All American, a surefire first round NFL draft pick, likely projected to go in the top 5. I've seen as high as top 2 or 3 in some mock drafts. He has 58 pressures on the year. That ranks number 8 in the country. He has 12 sacks. That ranks number 6 in the country. But he unfortunately injured his left shoulder against Boise State. He tried coming back into the game. He left after one play, and then they had a cast on his arm. And Franklin gave a I'm just going to read the quote. I've seen so many headlines say positive update, negative update, uncertain update. I actually don't even know what the update means. But Franklin, about the injury, said, quote, at this point, I don't think there's anything that is stopping him from playing, but it's just going to come down to, is he able to play? And we'll see. But his mentality is great. He's got a big smile. I think he's excited, but it's too early to say at this stage. So Franklin said there's nothing stopping him from playing, but it's unclear if he's able to play. So it felt like a very coach speak, non answer answer. And they also have a really great edge rusher off of, opposite him and Danny Dennis Sutton. He's got 7 sacks of his own. They have 39 sacks as a team. For example, Notre Dame has 37. So both teams are top 20 in generating pressure on the quarterback. Both Abdul Carter, it is the strength of this defense is getting after the quarterback. And then they're really stout against the run. They're top 25 in run success allowed. They're number 3 in line yards allowed, so they just don't get pushed around. Kobe King, their linebacker, probably the second best defender on the team behind Abdul Carter. He leads the team in tackles. He's just a machine in the run game. That being said, he's a liability in the passing game. He's been targeted 25 times this year and has allowed 22 catches at 13 yards an attempt. So if we can figure out a way to scheme Kobe King needing to be distracted and getting beat in the pass game, but in the run game, he is a real threat to be reckoned with. I'd be curious if you see more RPO looks, more play action looks in this game to try to slow down both that pass rush, but also put Kobe King and the Penn State linebackers in difficult matchups of trying to track Notre Dame receivers and tight ends while also trying to provide run support. I'm curious if there's a wrinkle to be had there. And then the one weakness that I'll call out, Mike, before I'll turn it over to you to discuss how they've gone up against some of their better competition. Same question we asked about the offense, how they looked against elite competition. But the one weakness that I think, if I've seen any kink in the armor on either side of the ball, they are not a good tackling team. They rank 110th in tackling rate. And this is where Riley Leonard, Jadarian Price, and Jeremiah Love, we've talked about it all year. They are some of the most elusive, hard to tackle, hard to bring down guys. And it is an area where Penn State has really struggled. They had 15 missed tackles against Oregon and SMU and a whopping 27 missed tackles against Boise State. I know they got away with it. I know they caused some turnovers, but they were not a good tackling team in that game. It really kept Boise State in it a lot longer than they should have. And so I think that's the big weakness that we could take advantage of. They're also pretty susceptible in passing explosiveness. They're 93rd in that category. But we've said this before. I don't think that's an area Notre Dame's going to take advantage. It hasn't been our MO all year. We are not an explosive passing offense. It's just not our identity. And so the place I'm looking at is that missed tackle number. Can Notre Dame break 15 to 20 tackles in this game? Can Jeremiah Love get loose for a big run? Can Riley Leonard turn 2-yard runs into 8-yard runs with just his tough to bring down? It's even hard to call him elusive. I just think he's big and fast, and he's just therefore too physical for smaller guys to bring down. I think that could be the place for Notre Dame to really find success in this game, find a mismatch. But that's just going to come down to two teams executing.
Totally. I think it's a familiar, I think, storyline where we'll flag a team susceptible to explosiveness, and for them it's the missed tackles. And then you get to the game, and then it'll translate to someone like Jeremiah Love having like a 80-yard touchdown run or something like that. So definitely something key to keep an eye on. I think the passing explosiveness, Brett, I think that's a really important point. But as you mentioned, not something that we are, I think, really capable of exploiting too much. Now, look, if Abdul Carter is out, who is their best pass rusher, the best defensive player, probably the best player on the team, I think. Warren is the best offensive player. Carter is the best defensive player, probably the best player overall on the team. But if he can't go, or if he's heavily limited, you would have to think that that would limit their pass rush. And again, I don't think we're going to be like airing it out and putting up a ton of points in the passing game. But at a minimum, that should allow us to take maybe a few more shots than we would otherwise, because you can allow Riley Leonard to hang back there a little bit longer than he would otherwise. Maybe you can attempt some longer developing pass plays. We don't want to lean on that because that's not our identity, but it does potentially open that up a little bit, which is an area that Penn State has struggled with. Now, moving on to how they fared against top offenses, similar to the exercise that we took when discussing the Penn State defense, it's important to keep in mind how the squad is done when they've been stress tests. And Penn State, they've played a lot of highly ranked offenses. Boise State, they were ranked number 11, SMU number 5, Oregon number 2, Ohio State number 9, and USC number 16. So this defense is very well tested. And in terms of the results, similar to the offense, it is a bit of a mixed bag. So for SMU, that they completely shut them down, less than 300 yards, had the 2 pick sixes. Boise State was a bit of a misleading box score. The game said 31-14, but Boise State actually had over 400 yards of offense and outgained Penn State. There were 3 crucial interceptions by the Broncos, plus a fumble, and then 2 missed field goals. So you got to keep in mind here that the game was actually 17-14 midway through the third quarter. And then after that, Penn State pulled away. Boise State got a little bit desperate after that, and then they threw the ball a ton and had 3 straight interceptions to end the game. So some of those stats, I think they require a bit of a double click. Shout out to Jim to make sure that you understand exactly what's going on there. Ohio State, limited to 20 points, one of their worst offensive games of the year. Ohio State has been, unless you've been living under a rock, Ohio State has been on an absolute tear offensively their last couple games. Now, this might be a scenario where Ohio State, Ryan Day in particular, insisted on trying to be the more physical team, and he wasn't really playing into the offensive strengths. So I think you also want to look at that a little bit with a grain of salt. But any way you want to slice, if you hold Ohio State to 20 points, that's still an impressive result. And then in terms of some data points that don't look so great for this defense, USC and Oregon really marched up and down the field on Penn State. We mentioned that Penn State's offense held up well against Oregon. That wasn't really the case for Penn State's defense. So again, overall, the answer here is mixed bag. It's a mixed bag from run-oriented offenses like Boise State finding success, and then also pass-heavy offenses like USC and Oregon. So it's I think it's just going into this game, there is a question mark from Penn State on both sides of the ball. It's which version of the Penn State offense, which type of Penn State defense are we going to see today? Because it's varied from game to game throughout the entire year.
Yeah, certainly varied game to game. But in all of those, I get it. They've had some closer than you'd want wins, but they played Oregon to a 7-point game. They played Ohio State to a 7-point game. And so we're really splitting hairs on look, if the defense that shows up against Ohio State and the offense that shows up against Oregon is who Notre Dame plays, I mean, no one's beating that team in the country. But also, those two games had their own game flows. The Ohio State was much more of a rock fight, slow, methodical, grinded out on both sides, limit possessions. And the Oregon game turned into a shootout. When it turned into a shootout, the defenses got gassed and the offenses kept pouring it on. So like game flow matters. So it's sometimes kind of hard to go look at any individual game and you step back and say, look, this is a really great matchup against Notre Dame. I think there's something obvious but worth saying. The turnover battle is crucial. Notre Dame is number 2 in turnover margin. Penn State is number 18. Penn State has had a massive 7-2 turnover margin in the first 2 college football playoff games. It's a huge reason why they're in this game. They lost the turnover battle 3-1 against USC, and it's the reason why they almost lost that game. They lost it 2-0 against Oregon in the Big Ten championship and couldn't overcome it, lost by 7. So that's gone both ways for them in a couple of games too. And I think it's going to be really important for Notre Dame and Penn State to take care of the football if they want to win this one. Other than that, man, it is like Notre Dame is staring in the mirror. It's a physical, run-oriented team. It's a physical defense built to beat both run-oriented teams like Michigan and electric passing attacks like Ohio State. So James Franklin has had to put together a defense that can go up against multiple styles of offenses. Al Golden has shown he can do that. If you look at the teams we've played this year, Georgia is built very different than USC is built very different than Texas A&M in terms of identities. We've gone up against triple option teams. Like I think there's very good balance on both offense and defense. Um, the one, the one other wrinkle that I've spent time thinking about is that Penn State has played some very high end quarterbacks. They haven't played a mobile quarterback. Dylan Gabriel at Oregon, Will Howard at Ohio State, Maddox Maxon at Boise, Miller Moss at USC before they made their QB change. Those are the 4 best quarterbacks that Penn State's played. None of those guys are mobile threats. Probably the most mobile quarterback they've seen is Kevin Jennings at SMU, who ran for about 30 to 40 yards per game this year. But really, that one was over so quickly when he threw 2 pick sixes to start that game. So they haven't seen a mobile quarterback like Riley Leonard. And that's not to say they'll do good or bad against a mobile quarterback, but it is their first time preparing for one. It's their first time going up against one with this defense. I think that's advantage Mike Denbrock. You compare that to Georgia, who's gone up against a mobile quarterback in Jackson Dart, a mobile quarterback in Jalen Milroe. Like Georgia's like, okay, we know what our base defense is going to be against mobile QBs. We've done this multiple times this year. Penn State hasn't. I'm curious if that turns out to be a narrative in this game. I think it's a place Notre Dame should try to test early and see if there's wrinkles that we can exploit Riley Leonard with his legs and really getting Penn State on their heels early and get them to make early adjustments to what we're trying to dictate.
Totally. So with all that, let's get into game predictions. The Vegas spread opened at 1.5 points in favor of Notre Dame, has since moved to 2. The over-under is 46.5, so that implies Notre Dame wins 24-22. So low scoring game, that's the expectation. SP Plus, we call this out at the beginning, but as a refresher, Penn State has a 0.3 a 0.3 edge. So SP Plus has this as absolute neck and neck. ESPN, the win predictor, has Notre Dame winning 59% of the time. But any way you cut this, it's virtually a coin flip. Coin flip that favors Notre Dame a little bit, but overall, this is essentially it's not a pick 'em, but pretty close to a pick 'em. In terms of my overall thoughts, I think that the Penn State offense, I think we're going to see the version of that offense that showed up, against a team like Ohio State. So I think when I'm looking at the different matchups, look, I think again, Brett, I agree with all the comments that we've made. I don't think that there's any clear differentiating factor on either team that's going to massively tilt the balance of the game. But I do think that we're going to hold up in man coverage. I think we're not going to allow them to get a whole lot out of the passing game. And I think on top of that, I think that our defensive front holds up against the run game. We really stifled Georgia, which is a very physical front, in the run game, and they weren't able to get anything going. So I think when you look at both of those together, I think it's going to be a tough day in the offense. Tough day in the office for the Penn State offense. I don't think they're going to be able to generate a ton of points on us. I think Al Golden he's proven himself consistently to be the gold standard, the golden standard. Maybe that's a better way to put it. In terms of defensive coordinators, and I expect to see that today. I don't know that we're not today, but in the Orange Bowl. But I think I don't think that we necessarily get there with Havoc. As we mentioned, I think that's going to be tough to generate. I think what'll I think they're just going to struggle to consistently put together any sort of chunk plays or put together a success rate that allows them to march downfield. And then on the other side of the ball, look, I have a ton of respect for this Penn State defense. I think we're going to struggle to put up points as well. I think this Penn State defense is just too good and too physical for me to believe that we're going to be able to generate a lot of points. But you mentioned one X factor, which is Riley Leonard and how effective he is running the ball. They haven't seen that. That's a new wrinkle. I think that we're going to be able to generate some very timely, effective plays, maybe a few chunk plays that'll really help us keep the ball moving downfield. I think in terms of the run game, look, my expectation is they're probably going to generally be able to hold that in check. But you mentioned that they have a pretty big missed tackle rate, so I wouldn't be surprised if we break one or two here or there. They generally hold us in check, but we break a couple. I don't think they're going to be able to generate a ton of havoc on us. We mentioned Riley Leonard's pretty great at that. And then one other thing I want to watch is obviously Abdul Carter is massive, but assuming he's at least limited, I mentioned this earlier before, but if if their pass rush is more limited than it would be otherwise, maybe we can get a little bit more out of the passing game than we normally could. They're a little bit susceptible to it. As I mentioned before, I don't think we're going to be able to just, I don't think we're going to look like Ohio State just torching them deep. But we might be able to get a little bit there, and maybe that opens up things, in other parts of the offense. So combining all that, I think what my heart is telling me here is that Notre Dame has an edge, but not a massive edge. And I expect this to be a rock fight. I expect it to be a hard fought, close game. I'm gonna pick another prime number for the Notre Dame offense just to just to get you thinking, Brett. I'm gonna say we score 23, and I will say that Penn State scores 15. So 23-15,
23-15. Okay.
23-15.
So
Yeah.
they go for a 2 point conversion late to try to cut it to 8 and succeed. And Mitch Jeter kicks 3 field goals. Okay. I like that. I can get behind that.
Yep,
Um,
yep. And 15 not being a prime number, but 23 being a prime number
sure.
to clarify.
So I'm in a very similar spot on a score. I just look if anyone out there thinks either of these teams has a big advantage, if anyone is sitting here thinking it's going to be a blowout, they're just not looking at data. Like the math just says this is a very great matchup to great football teams. It's why we have a 12-team playoff. It's why we're trying to get to the best 4 teams at the end of the year. And both of these teams have earned these spots, and that's why the spread's so close. And I agree. I think our offense is going to struggle in this game. I think the front seven for Penn State and what they do against the run, what they do to pressure the quarterback, it gives everyone fits. And I think we're going to do enough in breaking tackles. We're going to do enough with Riley Leonard's mobility that is going to show them something they haven't seen all year. And that's the best wrinkle I can come up with. And then just a high degree of confidence that um, Mike Denbrock just figures out how to, not score 40 points every game, but he figures out how to get in the 20s. He really has only been limited under 20 points once all year, and that was against NIU. Our obligatory NIU shout out in this game, in this preview. And other than that, it doesn't matter if he's playing Georgia. It doesn't matter if he's playing who he's playing, Texas A&M, you name it. He figures out how to get into that 20s number. And on the flip side of the ball, the number one thing I've been reflecting on is that their passing game and therefore their balance lives and dies with Tyler Warren. But he also hasn't gone up against Xavier Watts, Jack Kaiser, Jalen Snead, Jay Nosbury, and Adon Schuler, along with Clark and Hurd. And like, we are going to be able to throw a lot of different looks at Tyler Warren. We are going to be able to throw a lot of athletic safeties and linebackers. This isn't like we have, oh man, we got to put our most athletic guy on Tyler Warren because he's the only guy that can guard Tyler Warren. That's the approach for most teams. Here, I think we're going to be able to show a ton of different looks, a ton of different players, a ton of different healthy, fresh bodies at Tyler Warren. And I get it. He's the Mackey Award winner. Notre Dame hasn't given up more than 3 catches for 33 yards to a tight end all year. Tight ends do not have success against this Notre Dame defense because of all those guys that I just mentioned. And the other thing I've been thinking about is everyone should go follow Greg Flaming, Flammang, if you're on Twitter. He does a lot of film breakdowns on Notre Dame. And he talked about some differences that we showed against Georgia in our safety help in the run game. And Watson Schuler combined for 8 stops inside 2 yards of the line of scrimmage in run support against Georgia. So Al Golden came up with a lot of ways to make up for Riley Mills' absence. It wasn't just Donovan Heinisch and Gabriel Rubio stepping up to pair alongside Howard Cross. It was a total team effort in scheme. Um, and at the end of the day, I think this is a coin flip. And so if my head is telling me it's a 50-50, then I'm going to go with my heart. And I put all that into I don't think anyone's going to score 20 points against Al Golden. And I don't think Mike Denbrock is going to be under that 20-point number. So I've got Notre Dame winning this one 24-17 in a classic. Tough coin flip. If you actually have real dollars to bet on this game, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But step back and enjoy the show because I think it's going to be a great college football game for every fan out there. I think this game has something for you.
Totally agree. And hopefully the next time we're recording, we're talking about everyone coming to Atlanta, Brett's current home base, and yeah, the prospect of potentially winning a national championship. So with that, I'll do. Brett usually do the sign off, but I'll do the sign off here. I mean, we're in uncharted territories right now with Notre Dame
Uncharted.
football. Yeah. So with that, Gyrish beating Nittany Lions.
Irish beating it, Lions. Did we just jinx it? No, that's okay. We're manifesting championships. There's no superstitions here, but that was a little stitious.